So the presentation that I'll provide now is, I could say, now for something completely different from my previous, from the previous presentation by Paul, and perhaps the other side of things, kind of related to what we heard from Sveta earlier. So, Martha, if you can move to the next one. I just wanted to start with a brief introduction on a few AI-based applications in the business sector, and then I'll move on to describe some of the challenges with each of those, focusing on decision assisting technologies, but looking at some of the challenges that relates to the human-machine interaction in AI. So we tend to think about AI applications as kind of replacing some of the human elements in different processes. But what I want to shed light on today would be on where there is an integration and what aspects perhaps can use some enhancement in order to make sure that we improve the way that we embed AI applications in decision making and other in-house processes. So let's begin with a few of the AI-based applications in the business sector. And I looked at some of the main purposes for which they are being utilized with some examples for each one. And so the first one that I mentioned already is decision assisting technologies. And one example for this type of decision of technologies or AI-based application are risk assessments technologies, and those basically can assist the way human decision makers make their decisions. So some AI-based applications can make decisions on their own. Some of them can be used as aids to human decision makers. So the question here is really who is the one authorized to make the final decision, whether this is just the technology that goes on its own, or whether there is some human element at the end of this process affirming or accepting or rejecting the outcome provided by the technology. One aspect to think about this particular type of technology is the way that this is predicts the future or is future focused, really looking at trying to predict some risk that will happen in the future, assessing the intensity or the probability that this risk may occur, and looking at evaluating data based on a variety of assumptions because we are thinking about something that did not happen yet. Another type of AI-based application in the business sector is technologies used for automation of processes. So instead of having human elements in each and every part of the process, we just provide some automation for these processes in order to make sure that that they can run smoothly and perhaps sometimes without the human element in them. One example is this growing field of online dispute resolution systems in which you can basically provide some detail about your claim, and then the system can then take it from there, providing a technology-based solution for this process. Now, a third example that I wanted to highlight today relate to natural language processing, and these can have a variety of different purposes and utilization in the business sector. The one that I wanted to mention today is email surveillance in the workplace. So, for example, Microsoft Cortana and other types of language processing technologies that basically go through words amount of writing and then just analyze them. And they can analyze your mood, they can analyze your tasks, they can analyze your relationships. And the important or the interesting part here is that there are two sides that we need to consider. So the way that these technologies affect the daily work of the users, basically those of us who allow Cortana or other email natural language processing type of technologies to analyze our tasks or our emails or different types of communications. The other side of this is the one collecting, the body collecting the data. And of course, this raises or brings into this complicated scenario another complication, which is who receives access to this data. So there are issues of privacy, of data sharing, and data governance more broadly. And then the final last type of technologies that I wanted to mention today is visualization technologies. And in this sense, obviously not every visualization technology has an AI component to it, but some of them, including those used for facial recognition, for example, may have some artificial intelligence components to the technology, especially when we use these for particular applications, including, for, service providers, identification, and then evaluation of the person who we identify, and making predictions perhaps about what they need, what they want, what their interests are. So there could be very different usage of AI based technologies in the business sector, and each of those raises different types of challenges. So for example, in the facial recognition example, the challenges are can come from some bias in the design of the algorithm. We already know that the training of those algorithms is uniquely important in those areas, and so the error rate can be different based on your ethnicity or other the type of setting that was used to train the algorithm, right? So algorithms can have a lower error rate for some groups and then higher error rate for others. And the error rates more generally can be particularly important here, as it would become, because we're looking at future kind of or predictive, let's say, context, then proving errors, of identifying errors, is sometimes more complicated than in scenarios or context when we look at past events. Martha, if you can move another slide, please. Thank you. So this really brings me to the issue of prediction in a future-focused world. And I think that as technology advances, so is our aspiration, let's say, in predicting the future and predicting risk, forecasting behavior, thinking, about tomorrow, trying to make our businesses ready for some of the, tomorrow's challenges, but also trying to forecast what our customers are interested in, what they want, and feed that into them. So if you can see in the, I'm not sure that this is readable, but so I'll read you the cartoon here, and it says, and our unique Justify It feature uses deep learning to find data that agrees with your point of view. And I wanted to, I put that on the slide simply because I thought it really captures some of the, hidden biases behind some of those AI-based applications. Because one of the challenges here is that the epistemology of how we collect the data and reach outcomes or decisions is often invisible to decision makers, or invisible to users, and so it becomes much more complicated and complex for the human element or the human factors to integrate the outcomes of AI without fully being able to understand the epistemology, meaning how was the data collected, what are some of its limitations, what are some of the assumptions that we can't really evaluate fully. And that relates to the first point here on the slide, that we have shifting standards of proof and uncertainty. So it's not always clear when in the design process of the technology what is the standard of proof that we aspire to achieve, and what do we do, or how do we handle matters of uncertainty when some data is corrupt or limited, or have some other scope issues. And so I think the combination of this kind of growing aspiration to make better predictions and more prediction in more contexts, without fully, at least to kind of the sides of the users, without fully being able to understand the epistemology, the design of the algorithm, some of the inherent bias in the design process, and the vague standards of proof that are being adopted, makes this context more challenging than in the past. Next slide, please. Martha, can you? Thanks. So here I just wanted to mention a few um, kind of to focus more on AI and human-machine interaction, because I think this is one area that doesn't receive enough attention at the moment. So a lot of time we consider, is it okay to let, the technology make a decision for us? But it's less frequent that we consider, do we really integrate those technological decision-making processes, whether decision assisting technologies or automation or any of those, do we do that correctly, and how does that influence the humans in this process? Can we really adopt or evaluate properly the data or the findings that we receive, or the outputs that we receive from the technology? And so I just divided these into three different groups of challenges. The first one is some of the technical limitations of the technology in itself. The second one relates to the human technology relations. And then the third one looks at accountability and transparency. And so in the first group, we have that looks really at the technology and some of its limitations. We have partial data inputs and biased training data sets. So this is really about the design, which is not always can transform reality or what we want in a in a perfect world, right? And it links to the second one of the tech limitation itself. So not just that we don't have enough data or quality data, but it's also about the way that we can interpret or translate reality into very rigid baskets or categories in order to have the technology apply to them. And so this interpretation of the world has to include some subjectivity in it, which is not necessarily transparent to decision makers. And then there is always the option that technology just fails or malfunctions. And in my work on counterterrorism decision making, I've been able to demonstrate how this type of issue can lead to lethal errors that cannot be corrected. And so obviously, it depends on the context, but sometimes errors can be very costly. And this is something to think about. What do we do if the technology fails? And this really leads me into the second point about the human tech limitations, which is really about the eroding of human judgment. So the answer to the question, what happens if the technology malfunctions? Well, when the humans are now trained to trust the technology and just apply it on a daily basis, then our common sense, our human judgment become less robust than if we have to exercise this human judgment on a daily basis. It also includes this invisible subjectivity where we tend to trust the technology and trust the data without being able to fully evaluate some of its limitations and perhaps some of the partial data or the limits of the data that was fed into it. And thirdly, there are I'm happy to talk more on in the Q&A on some of the cognitive biases that are triggered by technology, including representativeness and anchoring biases, which really makes human decision making after that are based on some technology outputs not necessarily as robust as they could be because of the inability to fully evaluate some of the limitations of those outputs. And then finally, there is this accountability gap in the sense that when the humans in the human factors or human elements in this make some errors or erroneously interpret the technology, then it is often the case that the technology itself is blamed without fully acknowledging some of the internal processes that could be improved and that could have prevented those types of errors. Next slide, please. Okay, and so what do we do from here? Where do we take this? A few kind of last takeouts from this. How do we improve human-machine interaction? How can we better embed AI-based applications in our businesses? And so the first one is epistemological transparency, and I think this is really a key point because we have to familiarize every person that works with those technologies to understand how the data is being collected, what are the assumptions in the system, what is the quality of the data, what are some of the limitations of the technology, for example, how was the algorithm trained, what was the data set, and so forth. The other point is the need to identify suboptimal human-machine interactions. So we need to understand some of those areas where the technology is overly trusted, or when humans kind of learn not to exercise their own judgment and common sense in the face of technology-based data. And then finally, we have I'm suggesting in some of my other papers some enhanced accountability through organizational rather than individual responsibility. And this means that instead of looking at individuals and finding, those rotten apples or the individual that made errors, we need to look at processes, internal processes, and think again here as a future-focused type of accountability. So not about punishing or reprimanding those in need, but really rather those that what type of processes can be improved, including those that relate to how humans and machines interact. That would be it. I think my time is up, but I'm happy to expand on any of those during the Q&A. Thank you very much for your time and attention. And thanks for inviting me.
Thank you very much for the interesting presentation, Shiri. I think you sort of raised a number of interesting points there. Now, we don't have any questions as yet, so maybe I'll sort of kick off with a question from my side. So in your presentation, so if I hope I've summarized this correctly. So you sort of talked about the different application areas for AI, and then you presented some of the existing challenges, right, associated with using these AI techniques for automation, for decision making, etc. Now, but looking at let's say the second part of your presentation, it seems like there's still a lot of unsolved problems associated with using AI for decision making, right? So if SMEs are looking at using AI to either automate some of their processes or automate some of the decision making, then is there a guidebook for what level of automation they should go with, or what type of decision making they can delegate to AI and which ones they should retain themselves, so that they don't, basically negatively suffer from using AI? Is there a guidebook that's out there, or can you recommend some suggestions for SMEs?
So unfortunately, I don't, I'm not aware of any guidebook on that, but I think this is really the kind of, my presentation was probably the other half of Svetad's presentation earlier. Basically look, there are a lot of opportunities in here, but one thing that we need to consider is how will automation or decision assisting technologies affect the human elements that would remain in the system. And while I'm not aware of any particular guidebook, I do have a forthcoming publication on a behavioral approach to human-machine interaction. There are several books out there on human-machine interaction in various contexts, not necessarily the SME context, but I think some literature is out there already that we can learn from. And I think that it would be highly useful to just think about the way that technology affects human decision makers, and that type of interaction can entail, can affect humans in different way, skewing their own decision maker and decision making and judgments. So this is just something to consider and train. So not to prevent using those technologies, but just to make sure that these are applied in a way that does not cause does not bring in additional bias that remains invisible behind the scene, and then ultimately cause errors that may be pricey.
Yeah, yeah. So maybe just one more question, and I'd like to get your feedback on this. But before that, I think we've got a question from our participants. So, in your experience with business, do they not mandate some degree of epistemological transparency as a must? So that's a question from Devendra.
Yeah, so no, this is a very good question. And obviously, there is some degree of training and some degree of transparency. But look, I come from the legal field, and in my experience, lawyers are not fully aware of some of the technological elements. So even when you do the training and you're aware of some of the problems, it's not fully ingrained, so you don't really evaluate some of those inadequacies, let's say. So you can understand how the technology works and you can understand the data inputs, but then again, in order to fully evaluate it, you have to then enhance this to look at some of the design of the kind of go more deeper into the design of the technology, and how that and highlight some of the areas in which it can be misleading, or some different types of misinterpretations based on case studies from the past, because this has been the case in different organizations. And so I think even though some of it does exist, it can absolutely be enhanced into looking at some of the more sensitive areas that if you're not from with an IT background, then perhaps you don't fully understand and evaluate.